Writing is the breath of civilization, and its importance cannot be overstated. Writing is so important for civilization, since writing in its essence is the handing down of information across both space and time, in a preserved manner that direct human speech is not capable of. It allows the transmission of culture, technology and other sorts of learning and information across vast distances and among vast amounts of people on a massive scale that is not possible with merely human direct speech. And it also allows the transmission of these things across generations, across time, giving us history and knowledge about the past and about the experiences and knowledge of people coming before us, far back in time, even into prehistoric times. Because arguably the first writings weren't actually writing systems, but rather art. More specifically, pictorial art that depicted various events and happenings in the lives of people, conveying various feelings and experiences by these people. And pictorial art is actually older probably than mankind itself, as it dates back to the prehistoric age, before Homo sapiens sapiens was the sole type of humanity, and was maybe even done by people that were not modern humans but belonged to other species closely related to humanity, such as Homo sapiens, Neanderthalis and others, who probably also made pictorial art on cave walls. But regardless if the art was made by modern humans or species related to modern humanity, art was made by Stone Age peoples, depicting their own lives and thoughts in art, immortalizing in a way these thoughts and moments in their lives into our days, giving us a bit of information by transmitting it through time. Even if this art is very rudimentary and often very hard to interpret and limited in its ability to transmit information, it is still one of the earliest types of very rudimentary writing systems arguably, since it does transmit information across time in a non-sound based way. Though these weren't exactly true writing systems, and the very first true writing systems, as in organized systems of symbols representing various concepts in an organized, structured manner, appeared later in Mesopotamia around the end of the 4th millennium BC, and in Egypt around the same time too, and in China around the end of the 2nd millennium BC, and in Mesoamerica at around the beginning of the 1st millennium AD. Systems like the Egyptian system and the Chinese systems of writing were pictorial. They were based upon symbols representing entire concepts, or sometimes also specific sounds that were combined by other symbols in order to represent other concepts and ideas. These systems were probably evolved from previous systems of art that represented various ideas, and thus were in a way descendants of a long tradition of art, arguably dating back to a time even before the dominance of modern humanity. However, not all true early writing systems were pictorial. You also had phonetic writing systems too, where symbols represented various sounds instead of concepts, and where you combined various symbols in order to make words, reflecting the spoken language. Here you had the early cuneiform system of writing that developed in Mesopotamia, a writing system that allowed you to more or less mimic the spoken language but in written form, making these sorts of systems easier to learn as you only had to learn the sound symbols, and you did not have to learn an entire system of symbols and what they represented in connection to various concepts and in contexts, which arguably was an entirely different language in itself. Instead, you only had to know a limited number of sound symbols and know the spoken language that these symbols represented. Though these symbols could still be a lot to learn, since the earliest writing systems based upon phonetic symbols were based upon syllables and not on individual sounds. That did not appear until around the first millennium BC by the Phoenicians, who developed the first abjad. An abjad being a writing system with consonants and semiconsonants, but without vowels as a fully integrated part of the writing system, as the vowels are implied in the text. The introduction of an abjad system by the Phoenicians now meant that you had less symbols to worry about, since the number of individual sounds is always lesser than the number of syllables that are possible in a language. And thus it is often an easier system to learn and utilize than a syllable-based writing system, despite its lack of vowels, which was not a large issue for the Phoenicians or many of the other peoples of the Middle East that spoke Semitic languages, where the vowels are not as important as the consonants in giving meaning to words, due to the language structure of those languages. But in any case, this near-modern alphabet, developed by the Phoenicians, would later give birth to a lot of other writing systems, including true alphabetic systems of writing, such as the Greek alphabet in the early 8th century BC, which included both consonants and vowels in the writing system. The development of the alphabet system, a system that includes both vowels and consonants, made it so that languages which were more vowel dependent than most of the Semitic languages of the Middle East could easier be represented in written form. And from the Greek alphabet then descended other alphabets, such as the Latin and the Cyrillic alphabets, which together with the Greek alphabet are the commonly used alphabets to represent the various languages found today in Europe. But it is not only the writing systems that are important to discuss here, but also the mediums on which you wrote upon. First, you had natural mediums of writing, such as stone and wood, onto which you could carve into various writing systems or paint them on. Then you had more synthetic variants as well, such as clay tablets made from hardened clay, onto which before the hardening you had engraved various writing systems. You also had wax tablets on which you could write various things. Wax also had the advantage of you being able to erase the writing and begin anew, and thus wax tablets were a great way to train your writing skills and your reading comprehension on in early times, as well as a great way to pass on temporary messages that in any case didn't need to last for a long time. And engraving on wax was a lot easier than to engrave upon either wood or stone or clay, and also a lot more forgiving if you miswrote something, as you could easily begin anew to write it again. Other more classically used mediums, such as papyrus, appeared in the 3rd millennium BC in Egypt, where papyrus sheets were made from the papyrus plant. Hence the name papyrus, from which also the name paper derives. It comes all from this plant, which was primarily grown in Egypt, but later was also grown in Cyprus and in some limited places in the Western Mediterranean world as well. Due to the demands of the papyrus plants and the limited geographic regions in which the plant could grow, papyrus remained a rare commodity and was thus also an expensive writing medium, especially if you lived far away from where these plants were grown. But later alternatives to papyrus would be developed. In the 5th century BC, you had specially prepared palm leaf sheets that could be used for writing and to make manuscripts upon. And in the 2nd century BC, and probably earlier, you also developed the ability to treat animal hides to allow them to be used as writing mediums. And thus you developed parchment. The word parchment coming specifically from the Greek city name Pergamon, which has been claimed to be the original site where parchment as a medium was developed. But even if it was not developed there, it was at least a city that was famous for producing parchment. Both specially treated palm leaf sheets as well as parchment were expensive mediums of writing, since they cost a lot to make in the processes of making them. But they were still cheaper than papyrus had been for most people. And both palm leaves and animals that could be used to make parchment were still a lot more easily available than papyrus. And it is also with the appearance of these new mediums of writing, of these materials for writing, of both palm leaves and parchment, that you see the development of cursive styles of writing in both alphabets and abjads. Because with the introduction of these new materials, it becomes more common to write with pencils of various kinds and with pens and inks of various kinds. And when you write with, for example, a quill and ink, it is much easier to write in a cursive style than it is to make a cursive style in engravings upon stone or clay, which had been more typical before the appearance of these materials. And when you write with ink, it is also easier to make a cursive style than it is to write separate letters. This is not only due to the flow in continuous writing being easier to be maintained with a cursive style, but also due to the fact that a cursive style has less risk of ink splotching, as you raise the hand with the feather less in a cursive style writing, where all the letters are interconnected. And also, due to these factors, you can see that writing systems that appear after the introduction of treated palm leaf sheets, parchment, and especially later paper, are usually standardized to be written in a cursive style, with soft curves and interconnected letters, rather than as separate letters with sharp angles and straight lines. Compare, for example, the Arabic writing system with, for example, the Latin alphabet or the Greek alphabet, or even the Hebrew writing system. See the difference in sharp lines and curves and in how the letters are interconnected. And speaking about the Arabic writing system, you can even see how it developed to be even more curvy after the introduction of paper, going from the Kufic sharp angular script to the later, after the introduction of paper, Naskh writing style, as paper being an even more cheaper alternative to parchment and treated palm leaves meant even more writing with ink, and thus even more curvy writing, as curves are easier to do with ink than with engravings upon stone or clay. And speaking about paper, it was developed in Han China in the 2nd century AD and spread to the Middle East, or was developed separately in the Middle East in an attempt to copy the Chinese paper in the 8th century. In any case, the introduction of paper meant even more cheaper writing material than before that you could easily move around and spread information using. And thus the introduction of paper meant an explosion in knowledge exchange and in knowledge creation when people exchanged ideas that they had written on paper. And the introduction of paper was an important part in what would become known as the Islamic Golden Age of science. as it provided such a good medium of writing that was far easier to use than engravings upon stone or wood, and more permanent than wax tablets. And paper was also cheaper than the previously used sheet types of writing materials, such as papyrus, treated palm leaves, or parchment. Speaking about sheet types of writing materials. Sheet types of materials, such as papyrus, palm leaves, parchment, and paper, have had the advantage over other materials in that they have been easier to carry around, as you can carry more writings around than you can with other materials that are usually heavier and harder to make compact. In terms of information conveyed versus size and weight ratios, and thus have been easier to transport and carry around. And these were at first only carried around as simple sheets, or simply as pieces of writing material on which you had written stuff on. But eventually these pieces of writing material were rolled up into scrolls and had structures around them to be easier read as scrolls, such as scroll handles. And one long scroll is easier to carry around rather than a lot of different pieces that are separate from each other, or a non-uniformly formed piece of writing material on which you write text. Though we do not know the true origin of the scroll as a concept, we do know that the codex format, or as it is more commonly known in English, the book format, did not appear until around the turn of the first millennia in the Mediterranean world, and it would take several centuries for it to gradually replace the scroll as the primary writing format. The book or the codex had the advantage over the scroll in that it was easier to carry than scrolls and could contain a lot more information than a singular scroll, and was hardier as well, being protected by the book covering as well as by the fact that a torn page could, in the worst case scenario, be replaced. You can't really replace a section of a scroll, as it is just one continuous piece of writing material. You can also section a book in a way that you can't do with a scroll, with a book having distinct pages that you can categorize into various chapters and sections, making it into a superior instrument of organizing writing too. Speaking about instruments and writing, you have had a lot of instruments throughout human history connected to writing. You have had chisels to engrave into stone and other hard materials. You have had reeds and feathers with ink to write upon absorbent writing materials. You have also had various types of pencils, with everything from simple charcoal and chalk to various wax-based paints to pencils that, like today, used lead. You have also had various plants that you have used due to being naturally colorant as well. What all of these various instruments and methods of writing have had in common was that they were made by a singular person writing one writing, or copying one writing, which in the past made writings such as books expensive, as they were all handcrafted by specialist writers and copyists that either wrote unique works or copied other works. And it wasn't until in the 1450s, with the introduction of the Gutenberg press, where longer writings and books began to become commonly available to the masses. At first in Europe, and then later spreading out around the world, including the Middle East, where the printing press have had a rather complex history, especially with the Ottoman Empire, which I will go into detail with in a future video, probably. But regardless, the printing press revolutionized writing and the spread of writing and reading, as it made reading material available to the masses. And the next major evolution in writing was probably with the introduction of the 19th century telegraph that allowed for long-range communication that was faster than what any human being could travel. Now written messages could be transferred much faster and over much greater distances within a far shorter time span than before. And this allowed for a far greater degree of communication, coordination and exchange of knowledge and ideas than before. The telegraph is probably among the most important of inventions that occurred during the Industrial Revolution, because it allowed for such ease of communication and exchange of information and ideas, as well as coordination of large-scale projects across large areas of the Earth in ways that were not possible before. Another invention that was not as important, but still connected to writing, was the typewriter, because in 1874 the first commercially available typewriter was released. And this instrument was a blessing to those that could never get a good handwriting style that was readable. And it made also official documentation and writing more easily readable, as typewriters and their fonts became the standards for official documentations all around the world, reducing confusion and miscommunication caused by issues of interpreting handwriting. And today you have standardized fonts when you write in your digital documents or when you go on the internet. And speaking about the internet and digital mediums generally, such as messaging each other on phones and social media like Twitter, doing digital writing. They are just a continuation on the evolution of writing in a way, are they not? And with that question, I will now end this video, and I hope you liked this video about writing and its history. And also on the subject of writing, please write questions and comments in the comment section, and I will write back to you as quickly as possible.
Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.